afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on where you're joining this webinar. Welcome to LMU's special lecture series on international business and regional studies. My name is Unpack. I'm a professor of international business and management and director of Center for Asian Business and the Center for International Business Education of Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. Today's program is funded by D.K. Kim Foundation, our gracious benefactor of the Center for Asian Business for the past 7 years, and sponsored by the LMU Center for International Business Education. The Center for Asian Business was established in 1995 to promote better understanding between the U.S. and Asian countries through multiple channels, including international business courses, faculty research grants, student scholarships, special lectures, and movie screenings. LMU is one of the 16 universities in the country who received the prestigious Cyber Awards from the U.S. Department of Education. The LMU side serves as regional as well as national resources to students, faculty, and business practitioners. We have a great program today. Dr. Michael Green will discuss a very timely and important topic as the new Trump administration launched a week ago. Asia-Pacific countries, including China, Japan, and Korea, represent not only the U.S., but also our state of California's main trading partners, along with Mexico and Canada. As the second largest economy, China is considered a growing national security threat to U.S. as it builds allegedly more advanced AI technology. Japan re-elected the unpopular new prime minister who does not like China so much. South Korea is in a political turmoil as its president was impeached and indicted on charges of leading an insurrection last month when he briefly imposed martial law. Russia and North Korea has become a close ally, as demonstrated by the North Korean troops dispatched to fight against Ukraine. Amid these new developments, how the new Trump administration will keep the U.S. influence in Asia and its global leadership intact? I'm sure today's webinar will help us find an answer to this question. Before we start the program, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dale Smith, the Dean of the CBA, and ask her to welcome the audience. Dr. Smith?
Thank you, Professor Peck. On behalf of the College of Business Administration and Loyola Marymount University, it's my pleasure as the Dean of the College to welcome all of you to this webinar. As Young-Sung Peck described, this is certainly a very challenging time as we look at all of the geopolitics affecting the globe. And I was just delighted to learn that the center had connected with Dr. Green, with Michael Green, and he would be sharing his perspectives and insights. So once again, on behalf of the college, welcome to the webinar. I look forward to learning from Michael Green and hearing the conversation and answering the kinds of questions and the thoughts that folks have as we start to navigate this very tumultuous time in our geopolitical history. Back to you, Professor Peck.
Okay, thank you, Dale, for your warm welcome greetings and sharing your own perspectives about the topic we'll discuss today. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Jennifer Ramos, who will moderate the discussion with Dr. Michael Green, and she will introduce our speaker. Jennifer?
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. It is also my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Michael Green, and I will just say a little bit about it, and then we'll get to a discussion. He'll present a little bit, and then we'll get to a discussion.
Sorry, let me stop you. I forgot to introduce you, Jennifer.
Sorry.
Just to briefly introduce Dr. Ramos. She's LMU Director of Global Learning in the Office of International Programs and Partnerships, and she's also the Professor of Political Science and International Relations. As an advocate for global learning, she has lived, worked, and researched in multiple countries, including the Netherlands, France, Germany, Croatia, Mexico, and the UK. Professor Ramos has published books in the field of international relations relating to the use of force, technology, democracy, and her work has appeared in scholarly journals such as Journal Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, Journal Political Ideology, Human Rights Review, and international studies perspectives, among others. Back to you, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Young Sung. So again, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Green. Dr. Michael Green is a professor and chief executive officer at the United States Studies Center, headquartered in Sydney, Australia. Previously, Dr. Green was Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is on leave from Georgetown University, where he was Director of Asian Studies and the Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. He served on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House from 2001 through 2005. In addition, he has authored numerous books and articles on Indo-Pacific security and won several prestigious book awards. And as a fun fact, I'll just add that he holds a black belt in Laido, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and has won several international prizes on the Great Highland Bagpipe. So you're very welcome, Dr. Green. We're pleased to have you here.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Thanks also, Professor Peck, and to the Dean. No bagpipes today, I'm sorry, just geopolitics and business. And let me just start by telling you what I hear about LA right now and Sydney. Everywhere I go, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm from the East Coast, but everywhere I go, Uber drivers, students, when they hear my American accent, are asking me, how is it going in LA? And I don't know, because I live in Sydney, but I hope for all of you it's going okay. And I hope you'll take some reassurance and confidence from the fact that as far away as Australia, which sent firefighters to help, people are asking and care. I'm also really pleased to be speaking to your center, because what you're trying to do, which is link the study of business and the study of geopolitics and regional affairs, is hard. Most academics, most professionals are pretty much trained in one or the other. Business schools don't usually do geopolitics, and most regional studies don't generally teach business or marketing. But we're in a world where increasingly geopolitics and business are intermingling, and where you find, for example, that in surveys by Bloomberg and others, when corporate boards or CEOs are asked, what are the top things you're discussing in your boardroom now? Geopolitics is now always in the top three, because so many business decisions are shaped by events as far away as Gaza or the Taiwan Strait. At the same time, if you work in national security, if you're in the National Security Council or the Pentagon, you are trying to understand the approaches to innovation in AI or in semiconductors, which are absolutely critical inputs for military equipment, but also critical to national strength and competitiveness. And most of the colonels and captains and admirals in the Pentagon were not trained in business. So what you're studying and what your center's doing is really cutting edge, and I applaud you for it. I applaud Professor Peck. This economic security field is going to grow in importance to business, to policy, and I think in universities. One of the things people are trying to figure out in this fragmented global marketplace is the impact of the election of Donald Trump, and in particular, what the US posture in Asia, or in the Indo-Pacific, if you prefer, might look like for the next 4 years. Is it going to radically change? I will acknowledge we are seeing a lot of shock and awe in the first week or so of the Trump administration. And it's part of, if you follow the political analysis, it's part of Donald Trump's style to flood the zone. And he's trying to create so much change and so much shock and awe that he will appear unstoppable, and he and his supporters can achieve as much change as possible before he starts to lose power. Some people say he has a year, some people say he has months. Constitutionally, he has 4 years, but there's a midterm election, which the Democrats are very well positioned to win in the lower house. And he can't run again, despite what he says. And so the lame duck status for Donald Trump will start before he's halfway through his administration, likely. So he's flooding the zone to try to change. There are a lot of constraints on that change, and I think that's important to remember. In addition to what I just said about the midterm election and the lame duck status, he won convincingly the House, the Senate, the popular vote, and the Electoral College vote, but the margin is so small in the House, as you know. And within his own team, there are very divided views about what he should do. There are a few things everyone agrees on, like cutting taxes and deregulation. But there are a lot of differences that are going to have to be navigated. There are a lot of contradictions in what was promised on the campaign trail. So I'm of the view that you will see some change, but not as much as it feels like right now. And part of it is the structural constraints in the US political system, the checks and balances, the role of Congress, and so forth. But as a hybrid historian, political scientist myself, I think another very important constraint is the continuity in how Americans define their interests in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific. There is constant change, there's debate, there's contestation. But if you look at American engagement in the Indo-Pacific over the last 250 years, which I did in one of my books called By More Than Providence, you see in the larger trajectory a lot of continuity. There is something sticky about American interests. In my book, I began with the year 1783. The American Revolution was still being fought. But in that year, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Colonel Rogers on the frontier, what would now be Western Pennsylvania, maybe West Virginia, where he was fighting Native Americans and British proxies. And Thomas Jefferson said in that letter, when this war is over and we've won our independence, we need to move quickly because our spies in London have informed us that the British are preparing an expedition to cross Canada and find a route to the Pacific Northwest. And Jefferson was not the only founding father who had a vision for a future America that would stretch from coast to coast. And he was not the only founding father who knew about the Pacific. He knew about the British sea otter harvesting in the Pacific Northwest. He knew about Hawaii and sandalwood, which would be cultivated and then sold to Hong merchants in Canton for incense and for scented fans. And he knew about the Hong merchants in Canton and the huge amount of money the British were making, and he wanted the Americans to be there. And he knew that because some of the crews on the British ship were from the American colonies. And they jumped ship with the Revolution, and they came and told George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others about the Pacific. So it was far away. The colonies at that time barely extended to what's today Pennsylvania and Western Virginia. But there was somewhere a seed of an idea, of a strategy that the US had to be present, had to be engaged, and had to push others back if they tried to limit American access, trade, and security in the Pacific. And if you want a longer discussion of that, look at By More Than Providence. It's 245 years of history and 700 pages, but try to make it readable. So history suggests there's going to be a lot of continuity in spite of what presidents claim or promise, because interests are sticky. So let me unpack three specific issues in American engagement with the Indo-Pacific, case studies, if you will, and open them up and look a little bit at what's changing, what's not changing, where is the stickiness in American interests, where's public opinion, what's the role of Congress, what's the role of allies, what about trade and business and economics? How do these all come together to give us some sense of what will and will not change in American engagement with the Indo-Pacific, and how might it affect businesses or people going into business? Let's start with the big one, which is US-China relations. Historically, Americans and American leaders have wanted a strong China. In the 19th and most of the 20th century, China was very, very weak. And because it was weak, other great powers were trying to fill that vacuum, to carve up China. The Russians, the British, the French, the Austrians, the Italians, the Japanese. The Americans were of the view that we would be China's friend, and that we would prevent other imperial powers from carving up China. And of course, the Chinese would love us for it, and we would have a great commercial relationship. But the bottom line is, for most of American history, American governments and the American people had a bit of a romance about China and wanted China to be whole, to be secure, because it'd be good for business, it'd be good for geopolitics. We'd sell things to China. The British or the Japanese or the Russians would not be able to expand because China would be strong enough. And that was the view. And we were enemies during the first half of the Cold War. Nixon opened up relations in the 70s, and then we were friends, and then we went to frenemies. But even in the post-Cold War period, every president, since the Berlin Wall went down, since the Cold War ended, every American president has argued in speeches, in national security strategies, that the US and China have more in common than we do dividing us, and that global challenges, whether it's building a new world order for George Herbert Walker Bush, fighting terrorism for George W. Bush, fighting climate disasters for Barack Obama, that multiple presidents argued we have more to work together with China. That ended in the Obama administration. And the Trump administration in 2017 was the first since the early Cold War to portray China as a challenger, as an adversary. The Trump administration's 2017 national security strategy for the White House defined this new era as one of strategic competition. And you know who kept that? Joe Biden. The Biden administration went with the same basic assumption. The US and China are now in a period of intense strategic competition. The Biden people, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and others, said they wanted competition without catastrophe. They wanted to avoid war, but that we are clearly in strategic competition with China. I was in charge of China policy and Asia policy in the White House for a number of years in the early 2000s. A lot of us got together in a conference a few years ago, Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush, Obama, Biden, and we sort of asked what happened. How did this all change? And there was no real agreement, but there was a consensus of what variables probably mattered the most. The 2008 global financial crisis convinced Chinese leaders that America, Britain, the West was in decline. The emergence of Xi Jinping as a leader, different kind of leader, one willing to take more risk, more nationalistic, more confrontational, and steps that Xi took. In 2014, he gave a speech in Shanghai saying that there should be no foreign alliances. He called them foreign blocs, meaning US alliances with our close allies like Japan, Korea, Australia. China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea. In 2015, Xi told President Obama, we won't put military bases on them, but all 4 of those islands are now larger than LAX, the airport, and are bristling with weapons and huge military facilities. So a series of things brought us to this point. But there are limits on that competition. In public opinion surveys that I've done at CSIS and since moving to Australia, consistently you find that when Americans are asked, should we end economic relations with China? Should we decouple? You never get even 20% of Americans saying we should decouple. When Americans are asked, should we reduce technology dependence on China, 2/3 to 3/4 say yes. That, by the way, is very consistent with Japan, Korea, Australia, and Europe. And in fact, American trade with China today, although it's half of what it was as a percentage of American trade 7 years ago, it's now about 7 or 8% of all US trade, used to be 14%. Even though it's shrunk in relative terms to overall American trade with China today, bilateral trade, is still larger than China's trade with Japan, Korea, and Australia combined. So there's some limitation to how much Americans will support decoupling from China, in spite of high levels of support for what people are calling now de-risking, reducing dependence on China technology, competing technologically. I anticipate in the Trump administration, you will see some things. You will see the technology decoupling, just the technology part, not all overall trade, accelerating. You probably read about DeepSeek, the new Chinese AI app. I follow AI although I'm a history major, so don't put your faith in my technology assessment. But my view is that people whose judgment on AI I trust say it was a big leap for China, but it is not as big as it seems. But nevertheless, it's a shock. The markets reacted. And so I think you will see the Trump administration accelerating export controls on semiconductors and related technology to China, and more decoupling of the high tech sector. That's going to accelerate for sure. Japan, Korea, Taiwan are going to get caught in that, and in my view, follow the US trend, although somewhat reluctantly. You will almost certainly see Trump put tariffs on China. I think Biden, or excuse me, Harris would have as well. Beijing, China's economy is not doing great, and they're growing out of the economy by exporting excess capacity. So a lot of people would argue, and I would agree, dumping electric vehicles, batteries, and other products in North America and Europe. So Biden's kept and added to Trump's tariffs, and I think Trump will add more tariffs. I think Europe will add tariffs, and you may find others do, in large part because of China's export of its overcapacity in areas like autos, and in part because of the tech competition. Donald Trump's making noises about some kind of meeting and big deal with Xi Jinping. I don't think that averts tariffs, but it might delay it. It might moderate it. The other thing that will slow to some extent President Trump's love of tariffs, a love he developed in 1985, by the way, took out full-page ads in New York newspapers attacking Japan and Korea for the trade deficits and calling for tariffs. So this is not new for him. But the other thing that's going to limit it is, as any economist can tell you, or any sensible politician, tariffs make prices go up. They're inflationary. Donald Trump won largely because Americans are tired of high costs. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. But I do think you'll see more tariffs and you'll see more decoupling. Will you see war with China? No, I don't think so. Deterrence works. The large military capabilities and the American alliances mean that any use of force by China against Taiwan or Japan or Philippines carries absolutely existential risk for China, for its leadership, for its economy. But accidents can happen, and they're so-called gray zones, conflict in areas where the US doesn't have a clear security commitment, conflicts in space. And for sure, the tension around Taiwan, the tension in the South China Sea, especially vis-a-vis the Philippines, is not decreasing, it's increasing, and China has more stuff. They have more ships than the US Navy, not as good, but more of them, and definitely more in the Pacific. They have a lot of firepower. And that is emboldening the PLA. And so it will remain a constant watch area and an area of tension. But deterrence really matters, and war is very, very unlikely. Obviously, if it happened, it'd be bad for business. Studies have shown a $10 trillion hit to the global economy, $10 trillion, and that's a conservative estimate. So that'll keep you up at night. Let's talk about another area. I touched on China, I touched on tariffs. Let me touch on a third, which is alliances. Donald Trump has the, in many ways, well-earned reputation of being hard to deal with if you're a US ally. And he had very open spats with some pretty close US friends, Mexico and Canada, for starters. There's a lot of worry that alliances in Asia will come under real pressure from Donald Trump, that he wouldn't defend allies, that he'll threaten to pull US troops out if allies don't pay more for the hosting of those US troops, and so on and so forth. And the New York Times reports that President Trump has been in 4,000 lawsuits in his career. That's a lot of lawsuits. And so you can tell this is a guy who will immediately go to confrontation and try to get a better deal. But are US alliances really in big trouble? I would argue not, actually. I would argue there's a lot of solidity behind US alliances in the Indo-Pacific. One reason is because the American people and the US Congress and our allies have now fully come to understand how critical these alliances are. You can see it in public opinion polls. Support in America for US alliances with Japan, Korea, Australia, and NATO have been very high since the Ukraine invasion. Support for alliances with the US in Japan, in Korea, are 90% or higher. 90% or more Japanese and Koreans support the US alliance, which means support for the US alliance in Japan is higher than support for karaoke, and maybe even higher than support for K-pop in Korea. 90% plus in a poll is really significant. Doesn't mean Japanese and Koreans love the Trump administration. Polls show that most US allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, would have preferred Harris. Although interestingly, in India, in Vietnam, and other parts of Asia, it was closer. Doesn't mean that there's that America is more lovable, but we're more indispensable because of China. And that is pretty clear to Americans too, as I said. It shows up again and again in opinion polls. And it's particularly true if you follow the US Congress, where support for alliances is very high. When Donald Trump was president the first time, and he mused about pulling troops out of Korea or Japan, Republicans in the Senate, including people like Lindsey Graham, people who support him on Fox News or CNN, introduced legislation in the Congress saying the administration cannot pull troops out of Japan or Korea without approval from the Congress, because of course Congress controls the budget. And that was just Republicans telling Donald Trump, no, you can't do that to alliances, and some of his closest allies. So within the American political system, reflecting American interests, there's a lot of support for alliances. Does that mean that President Trump won't say some outlandish things, demand more? No. Does it mean allies shouldn't do more? No. In fact, there are a lot of people in Australia who think Australia should get pressured to spend more on defense. It spends about 2.1%. That's above the NATO requirement, but it's below the US. Japan is increasing its defense spending to 2%, but the yen is now cheaper, so that 2% is not what it was. So a lot of people in Japan and Australia would argue, yeah, we should be paying more, and that might be the basis for a tough but legitimate conversation between Washington and the allies. But the alliances are solid, and Americans know it. It's in public opinion poll. The Pentagon, in order to position itself to deter China from using force, cannot have all of our bases concentrated in Japan and in Guam and in Korea, but the Korea bases are mostly to do with North Korea. It needs to spread out and have more access in Northern Australia and the Philippines. What does that mean? It means that the US, for its own interests, is relying more on allies to have our military postured to deter conflict. The Trump administration, like the Biden administration, wants to reduce technology dependence on China, limit exports of key technologies around semiconductors and AI to China. Well, guess what? The US doesn't have the dominant position on semiconductors. That's Taiwan, Korea, and for semiconductor manufacturing, Japan. So you can't handle your China policy or your de-risking or disentanglement or decoupling policy without allies helping you. So on public opinion, on force posture, on technology, the US is more dependent on allies. And allies know that to deal with a very powerful China, they are more dependent on the US. There's a lot to work with there. European allies are more worried because the right wing of the Republican Party, going back to the American Civil War, which we can talk about, has been skeptical of Europe, the old country, the corrupt, socialist old country, and always more enamored of Asia. And even Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, in his opening statement, very short statement, mentioned that the Indo-Pacific will be prioritized. He didn't talk about NATO. So the European allies are more worried than Asian allies. But Asian allies like Japan and Korea have been very clear that Ukraine matters to them, that the increasing alignment of China and Russia, and also North Korea and Iran, the fact that there are North Koreans fighting against Ukraine in that conflict, that Russia is helping North Korea to develop its military technology, that China is doing everything short of sending weapons to keep Russia in the fight against NATO. All of this means that NATO is more focused on Asia, and Japan, Korea, Australia, and India, the so-called IP4, are more focused on Europe and are going to say to the Trump administration, you cannot help us in Asia by pulling back from Europe. It is one front in many ways. So the allies in this whole debate in Washington will have agency. They'll have influence. Here's the bad news, though. Ishiba-san, the Prime Minister of Japan, is in a very weak position. He is in a minority government. He does not have a majority. He depends on the kindness of other politicians to pass things. It's entirely possible he will not be prime minister in a few months. Obviously, Korea's had quite a bit of drama in domestic politics. The indictment of President Yoon. It looked like the opposition party was going to sail to victory, but now polls show it's a much closer fight because many Koreans feel the opposition party on the left, the Minchudong, overplayed its hand in going after Yoon. But the bottom line is there's volatility in Japan, there's volatility in Korea, and Australia has an election coming up in just a couple months. So allies have agency, but if you care about that, you need to watch their politics because America is not the only country with some pretty interesting politics these days. So why don't I end there, Jennifer? I look forward to your questions and our discussion and questions from the rest of the audience. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Green. That was a great overview, I think, for our students here, and really interesting. My first question I wanted to talk to you about, what some would argue is the decline of the global liberal international order. And in thinking about that, China offering an alternative vision, and it's recently had several initiatives, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. How successful do you think China has been in offering an alternative to the Western-dominated international order? And also in there, what role does the U.S. play in China's vision?
It's a great question. I think that what scholars call ideational factors. Material factors in international relations would be things like nuclear weapons or trade figures or things you can touch and count. Ideational factors are things ideas, ideology, norms. This geopolitical competition is as much about ideas and norms as it is about nuclear weapons or technology or trade. And of course, they're related. The technology and the norms are very related, but this is a geopolitical competition about ideas and about norms. When I was in the White House, and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were the leaders of China, they avoided confronting the US and the West on ideology. Internally, of course, the party maintained control and taught that socialism with Chinese characteristics is obviously the best system for China. So there was competition, but Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao were very careful not to confront the US and the West over ideas and norms because they didn't think they were strong enough. And they were, I think, probably were a little bit afraid of unleashing a debate within China. And so, for example, when Jiang Zemin had one of his first meetings with President Bush, who was very Christian, President Bush, who, by the way, I was in those meetings, he got on great with China's leaders. He lived in China when his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, was the first US representative to the PRC, bicycled around. He was very strong in allies, but he really sought to understand China and develop relationships with the leaders. So he told Jiang Zemin, China's changing and the Leninist ideology behind the Chinese Communist Party is going to prove insufficient, you might find. And you might find if you let Chinese people worship more freely, it will stabilize your society as your economy grows. And so Jiang Zemin was an engineer from Shanghai. So the next summit, he says to President Bush, I heard what you said and I looked at the Bible, but it doesn't seem scientifically reasonable to me. But he listened to him, and Hu Jintao would listen to President Bush. And under Xi Jinping, it's very, very different. There's a direct, almost zero-sum ideological framing of the competition. It came from the US side. Of course, the US has always debated, all democracies have debated China. Even in the best of times, you had people attacking China's human rights record and so forth. But the larger push, I think, came from Xi Jinping. And you now see it really manifest in foreign policy and China's image to the world. So the Global Development Initiative is the idea that China is going to help countries develop by having no strings attached. So it's directly aimed at undercutting US or European or Japanese aid. And the Global Civilization Initiative argues basically all this talk about democracy is not fit for everyone. What's important is civilizations. So we should preference China's civilization or Brazil's civilization. And, you know, the implication being that ancient civilizations don't need democracy. So to American ears, it's pretty silly. And I've actually, not recently, but in the past, I've done polling on this in the region. And among elites, among political elites. But public opinion polls show somewhat similar trends. And what you find is that in the Indo-Pacific, democracy, including good governance, free and fair elections, human rights, women's empowerment, that those norms score much higher than China's development model. So, and in 2024, we had the largest percentage of people in the world vote ever in our human history. And although democracy has many, many challenges, including in the US and in Japan and in Korea, overwhelmingly polls show that people think it's the best form of government. As Winston Churchill said, except, you know, it's the worst form of government except all the other kinds. But in our poll, we also found when you asked in developing Asia, when you asked in kind of post-colonial Asia, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand was not a colony. But if you ask in developing, but especially post-colonial Asia, what do you think about the norm of non-interference in internal affairs? In other words, outside countries being able to tell you if you're democratically governed or not. And on that one, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, the OECD developed countries were all with the US. It's a stupid norm. But Indonesia, India, Malaysia, on that one, they were more with China. So, so yes, the Americans are right. Governance, democracy, it's the best form of government. But don't tell us what to do. And so the Chinese are trying to play at that seam. And the other thing they bring, of course, is a lot of money. And democracy is all good, but for a lot of these countries, you know, building bridges is also good or even better. So it's very much a contest. And I think in places like India, actually, despite what I said earlier, in Japan, Korea, in the Philippines, and countries that China is bullying, it's not working at all. But in other countries that are a little more removed from the geopolitical confrontation, like the Maldives or Sub-Saharan Africa, it's working. I'd say China is gaining more ground than we are. And it's really something the Trump administration is going to think about, because they will have a penchant to make things black and white, good and evil. And that's not the play that's going to work.
Yeah, actually, could you say a little bit more about how these countries in Asia are navigating the US-China rivalry? You know, countries like Singapore or the Philippines, you know, trying to both play both sides in a sense, right? Have their cake and eat it too. They might have a geopolitical alliance, but they might also have strong economic ties to the other. So how are countries navigating that? Is there a good example of one that's doing that well and managing to stay neutral?
In some public opinion polls, you can see this. And in some ways, if you travel as I do in the region, you can feel it. Korea, Japan, the Philippines increasingly, definitely Australia, New Zealand. If it goes really badly between us and China, they're with the US. The public opinion polls and more clearly the governments, even if they don't say it, that's clear. And India, by the way. It doesn't mean India sent troops, but India does not want China to prevail over the US.
Okay.
And then there's a category of countries that is pretty big that would prefer not to choose, which is most of Asia. And you know, it's very complicated and volatile. In Southeast Asia until last year, in polls of elites across Southeast Asia, elites preferred American leadership to Chinese. But last year, China eked out the US slightly during the Biden administration. What happened? The Biden administration was very engaged with Southeast Asia. What happened was Gaza. So Muslim, Indonesia, Malaysia in particular, but parts of Singapore, Philippines, they saw a kind of imperialism that they didn't like. And the Chinese and the Russians were very effective in propaganda and social media, portraying themselves as being on the sides of the oppressed class and America and Japan and US allies and NATO being on the side of the Zionist imperialist oppressor class, a little bit like college campuses in the US, and we're very effective. Now, in a year or two, the US will be on top, but it is a contest of ideas, very much so. And most countries, the big economies are with us. But most countries really don't want to choose, and frankly won't choose. They'll just try to stay out of it. And they will try to get what they can from China and what they can from the US. And some of them, like Vietnam, will be very good at it. So supply chains are rapidly shifting from China to Vietnam. So some countries, India and Indonesia are the same, will really benefit from strategic competition as the US, Japan, Europe, Korea shift supply chains because of technology away from China and manufacture more high-end things in the US, but also in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and India.
Great. If we could turn to Taiwan specifically a little bit more, I'm thinking about on the campaign trail, Trump called for it to pay for its own defense and will pay us for its defense and accuse them of stealing, US semiconductor business. I'm wondering to what extent there'll be maybe a pawn or a bargaining chip, so to speak, in the rivalry between US and China. And we've also had quite an ambiguous policy about defending Taiwan in the first place. I wonder if that will also continue, or if that will be more black and white, like you mentioned, the Trump administration, thinks in that perspective. Just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump telling Taiwan, you should be paying us. And it reminded me, when Donald Trump first, appeared in 2015 as a candidate, I happened to bump into an old college classmate who was an attorney in New York for a bunch of banks, and had been involved in renegotiating debt. Donald Trump owed this particular bank a lot of money, that common story. So he said that Mr. Trump came into the room, started yelling at the bank, saying, "You guys should be paying me. You should be paying me." And that's how he began every negotiation. And that he had instructed, because it was well known in New York in banking circles, to instructed the CEO and the CFO of the bank just stay calm, don't overreact. It's how he starts every negotiation. So a certain amount of it's disruptive, but much of the region has learned to discount it. To be honest, it's not so effective a negotiating tool if people realize it's a bluff most of the time, but not always. So it is disruptive and it might be effective. Taiwan, Taiwan is incredibly important to the US in many ways. And Americans kind of like scrappy Taiwan, small democracy doing really well. But in general, in the Congress and public opinion, there was a lot of nervousness about whether we should be putting our whole national security on the line for 25 million people sitting right off the coast of China. So there was a bit of ambivalence too. And some US allies like Australia feel that way. I think over the last 5 years or so, that has started to really change, and support for Taiwan has really grown, and people have realized how important it is in the US, but also in Japan, Australia, and elsewhere, and Europe. One reason is what happened in Hong Kong. So when the PRC cracked down on democracy in Hong Kong, and there were young, university students and workers in the streets protesting, that was inspiring, but also it was a reminder that the so-called one country, two systems model didn't turn out well for Hong Kong. So if you were on Taiwan, why would you agree to that? And Tsai Ing-wen, who was running for re-election at the time, used that in her campaign. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong. And she crushed the slightly more pro-Beijing opposition. And I think, broadly speaking, the world saw this, but especially young Japanese, Singaporeans, Koreans, who on social media could see young, cosmopolitan, middle-class kids like themselves on the front line of freedom getting shot at with tear gas and stuff. So that was, the democracy thing was big. The other factors, people began, maybe less the public, but more the governments, began realizing how important TSMC is, the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturer, which is really important for everything we do in tech. And so peace in Taiwan matters, but also keeping that independent matters. And I think among strategists, there was a relook at Taiwan as China's military power grew and as China began projecting air and naval power, not just across the strait towards Taiwan, but around Taiwan and around Japan and towards Guam. And people really began to appreciate that Taiwan is in the front line. And if Taiwan fell, then the PLA would have a huge base right on the southern flank of Japan, able to cut off one of the most important sea lanes in the world, cut off Australia, project power well on the way to Hawaii. It's geographically, it's not acceptable. So on the whole, in public opinion, support for Taiwan has inched up, but in the US Congress and among national security experts, it's really, really grown, except for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is nothing if not consistent, and he has retained his zero-sum transactional, you owe me negotiating stance. He's said to people, and it's become public, that why would I defend Taiwan or anyone? So that he is the president, and as much as structure and continuity matters, the president also matters. So that's a bit of a wild card that makes me nervous. But in terms of the congressional support, his own administration, Marco Rubio, the National Security Mike Waltz, these are very stalwart supporters of Taiwan. And they will be hearing, and Trump will be hearing from Japan in particular and others, how important Taiwan is. So on the balance, I'm confident in US support for Taiwan, but there are some wild cards.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much for asking some great questions to Mike. We have about 10 minutes or so left. So by the way, we had a great webinar last fall on Taiwan's trade issues. So those of you who missed the webinar, I think that you guys can watch the video posted in Cyber website. So I'd like to, take care of some of the questions posted through the Q&A box. I'd like to begin with a question from a student from my class, Aaron. Mike, you already mentioned that if you look at the, the long-term perspective, that we had actually had a more cooperation than competition for a long period of time. So I think the Aaron is asking a question about, given our history of working together with China and how things are changing globally, what is your take on the chances of US teaming up with China again? So he's asking about what kind of steps that we need to take to handle any political challenges and make the most out of our shared interest. So if there's any area for cooperation that you can anticipate, aside from the competition in the strategy, we call it competition. So we cooperate at the same time we compete. So can you think of any areas that we can actually cooperate together?
When I was in the White House 15 to 20 years ago, the list of areas where we could cooperate was not bad. Although the Bush administration took a more, limited approach on climate compared to Clinton and Obama, we nevertheless did have policies to develop technologies that would reduce CO2 emissions and to create business incentives and so forth. And so in that aspect of climate, cooperation with China was considered a net positive. We, on balance, did more together to stop North Korea than we did competing against each other. The Chinese hosted the six-party talks at our request or under our pressure to deal with North Korea. The Chinese were unhelpful when North Korea launched missiles, but when North Korea did nuclear tests in the UN Security Council, China was helpful. We worked with China. I had dialogues and trips to China to work on problem spots like Myanmar and even Sudan. And China at that time was interested in improving the business environment in China for foreign firms. So we had some agreements on intellectual property that were limited, but positive. I'm thinking today, none of those areas are ripe for cooperation. None of them. In trouble areas like Myanmar, China is exploiting it as much as possible to undercut the US. The foreign ministry has no latitude from Zhong Yanghai, from the leadership, to cooperate with the Americans or the Japanese or others. So that list that we thought in the Bush and into the Obama administrations had some balance between cooperation and competition, the cooperation part's almost all gone. The areas where we should, if we're rational, cooperate are, for example, academic exchange. But those are being very, very negatively affected. The number of students going from the US to China is declining. You know, I'm a professor at Georgetown. A lot of Georgetown students go into the US government. They don't want to study in China because it's harder to get a security clearance. The Chinese government is discouraging Chinese students from studying in the US. As a result, the University of Sydney is full of Chinese students, or in UK or Canada. That's a bit silly to me. The next generation who will be leading this relationship in 30 years needs to know each other, because we'll get through this, in my view. So academic exchange should be richer than it is. You know, both sides are to blame. A lot of it's the Chinese side. There's been a major, major crackdown on academic freedom in China. Programs like NYU in China or Yale and Shanghai and so forth have really struggled because of the pressures in the classroom to monitor thought and discourse. So China's made it difficult, but I think that should be an effort. I saw there was a question about scientific collaboration. Ideally, if you're a chemist, or if you're a biologist, or if you're at National Institutes of Health, you want peer review and collaboration with China because the scale is so big. There's so many people working on topics you can, but there's so much evidence of intellectual property theft. Not every Chinese researcher, to be sure, probably not most. There's so much evidence of intellectual property rights theft and such explicit competition declared by China in 2015 in its Made in China report, in biotech, in semiconductors, in health sciences, everything, that it's very, very difficult, I think. I think American universities, globally, universities are going to find it harder and harder to collaborate with China. But we should try and find those areas, in my view. And I think we have the possibility to look at trouble spots like North Korea or Myanmar, the Middle East, Sudan, and maybe, not soon, bend it back to a point. We collaborated with the Soviets on some of these trouble spots sometimes. And so we should be able with China to get back to a place, not soon, where we can take international diplomatic hotspots and actually leverage our influence. But the list is much, much shorter of positive cooperation than what I had to work with when I was in government. And I don't think it's going to get bigger anytime soon.
Well, indeed, our dean, that was Dale's question about how we actually can manage better, right, the relationship that we have with our academic scholars in China. And she asked, could that have the potential to change the geopolitical landscape?
As someone who spent half my career as a professor and half my career in government, the professor side of me wants to say that professors can change geopolitics, but certainly can contribute to what policymakers call intellectual facilitation.
Right.
So, academics, Professor Pak, you and I could gather 10 of our friends from Beida and other Chinese universities and have a very good discussion of cross-straits issues of the Korean Peninsula. But chances are the government in Beijing would completely ignore it, and it wouldn't be implemented. So, but what scholars can do is this intellectual facilitation, take ideas, test them, show good approaches, and keep doing it so that people in government start eventually picking it up. That's where scholars can really contribute.
Right.
Number one. And number two, as I said, is building a generation that in the future will manage the relationship, hopefully in a better space, trying to grow the areas of cooperation. That won't be easy, but I think it is doable. It is doable.
Okay, good. Well, here's another interesting question I found. Some analysts point to the U.S. recent nationalism stance. You also mentioned about the economic security at the beginning of your talk as a contemporary resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine, at least philosophically, in the form of more aggressive foreign policies and less integration. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this notion? And if there are indeed historical similarities, would China be in a solid position to fill US's diplomatic vacuum?
So there's no doubt, just read what he says, that Donald Trump would like to have a, not even imperial, but almost monarchical presidency, where he can just change the name of the Gulf of Mexico and demand that Panama do what we want, or he'll, but I think many of our allies and friends realize, as many of Donald Trump's business counterparts realized when he was doing real estate, that it's a lot of noise and a lot of fury, and just stay calm. And the US has interests, the American public has views, and the Congress has a role, even though it's under the Republicans. The depth of support for alliances is strong, and so there's a lot more smoke than fire when it comes to the Trump era's nationalism and unilateralism and nativism. But as the saying goes, where there's smoke, there is fire. So there are some areas where this attack on the traditional post-war institutions will matter. One would be in trade. Donald Trump really turned against the World Trade Organization. Biden didn't do anything to fix it. He was almost as bad, to be honest. It's certainly going to continue in that direction under Donald Trump. So the international rules for trade are going to be affected to some extent. The Paris Agreement on climate. But for every one of these, you can argue the other point of view, which is, well, what is the climate Paris Accord? What has it actually done to reduce emissions? I mean, that's happening by the state of California, or by decisions made by ExxonMobil or New Zealand. I mean, so, how much do we really get out of these? And on the World Trade Organization, the WTO hasn't actually liberalized anything in a generation. It has a dispute resolution, which is used to resolve disagreements that violate the rules. In my view, America should be supporting that, and we're not. But these institutions, which I support, to be clear, that were built after the war, they're not as relevant as they were. It's not like they're VHS videos. They're not that irrelevant, but we are in a world system 2.0 or 3.0, and they're still the 1.0. And so if this goes well, the Trump shock will lead to a discussion with close friends like Australia or Japan or Britain about, okay, what does the new rules-based order look like? Because clearly the old one was not fit for purpose, even though it still has its merits. Out of the destruction, I'm an optimist. Maybe there's a new effort. It won't include China at first, but maybe a broader dialogue that has the consensus of 2/3 of the global economy, Europe, America, Australia, Japan, Korea, and so forth, India, starts to bring China in. That would be a good scenario to end on an upbeat note.
We're almost running out of time. Let me ask you the final question, and then you just answer short. What do you believe the most critical steps that the U.S. can take to strengthen its alliances in the Indo-Pacific region and the current strategic competition with China? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, this is going to be a very inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. answer. But if you're following, it's probably not showing up in the LA Times, but it's front page in the Washington Post. The Trump administration has frozen all foreign aid. They've sent all the career officials home from the White House. They're basically trying to neuter official Washington. It won't last. They don't have the authorities to do it, but it's chaos. And the best thing the Trump administration can do is to stop that. They won the election. They can redesign foreign aid, but don't freeze it. Development finance, the Development Finance Corporation, which really took off in the first Trump administration, finances infrastructure in Asia that helps American business, helps compete with China. All that's frozen. So the best thing they could do is cut it out. Let American business, let the American government have the tools it needs to compete. That'd be the number one thing. And number two would be get good people. And in my view, on Asia, the Trump administration actually has some pretty good people. I know Marco Rubio, he's pretty good on Asia. The people in the White House are pretty good, but there's also some really interesting characters who bring views that are contradictory. So those are very Washington answers, but that's what I would focus on.
Okay. Well, I have many other questions, including that the trilateral alliance that Biden has emphasized during his time. And I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned about it was the Obama administration actually that we start to do containment policy. Probably TPP is the one thing that comes to my mind, that kind of initiative to try to drive that idea. But we already passed 6 o'clock, so
Yeah.
I think that I'd like to thank so much Jennifer and Michael for leading the webinar today. It was very informative and interesting. Thank you so much. And unfortunately that, we are running out of time, so I was not able to get to, I think, that a couple more questions. But again, thank you so much, Jennifer and Mike, to talking to the LMU community today. I really appreciate sharing your knowledge and insight into the critical relationships with the U.S., between the U.S. and Asian countries, particularly in China. Finally, before we wrap up the webinar, I'd like to thank all of you who joined the webinar today. Audience, I hope that you have enjoyed the program. We'll be back with another program hopefully in February, so please stay safe and healthy until then. Before you leave, I really appreciate it if you could complete a brief survey at the end of this webinar. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, and good night.